where there were design charrettes that were going on, a term that prior to getting into
Design
development.
Charettes.
Yeah. That's a term that I had never heard until I got into the industry. And
does that have anything to do with trades?
No.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so today, everything Coral Gables, because I have yet to ask some questions that I've been meaning to ask. So let's start at square one. What was your original vision for the Coral Gables site, footprint, parking, and intended uses, especially being right across from the University of Miami?
Yeah, so the project is called Thesis now. At the time, it was called Paseo de la Riviera. Right? And so we had a lot of things going on with the name as time went on. But one of the big things that for the project in general was that we had 3 or 4 major components. And so when I first got started in the project, we were still scoping all of that out. So I got hired by NRI very early in their entry into Coral Gables. They had already identified the site of the Holiday Inn and started to work on what it was going to become. And the core concept was already established by Brent, who is NRI's CEO. And he had come up with the vision of having a hotel, because there already was a hotel that was generating a lot of income, a multifamily complex that would primarily serve the student population, but also be market rate. And I can go into details about why it ended up that way. And then the retail and parking. Right? A lot of times people don't think of parking as like a fourth component, but for a lot of reasons we did there. I forget exactly how many stories we had on both sides of it. Coral Gables does a number of feet. So different municipalities or jurisdictions will have it. Some will do a number of stories that you can do. And then you have to define what is a story. Can you make each story 30 feet tall, right?
Yeah.
So it gets a little bit more complicated. The easier thing is number of feet. Coral Gables measured the number of feet that we had. And so what we were doing is looking at the Gables 1 tower, which was next door. It's the big white building that has the U for the University of Miami on it. If you're headed southbound on US 1, you can see that. And so we were right next door to that on the same block as that, and said we should be allowed to go as tall as they go. And so that was our original request for height. And then the core components of the property, we were underwriting the hotel about where we ended up in terms of number of rooms. The original Holiday Inn had 144 rooms in it, and the Thesis ended up having 245. So we knew we wanted to increase just based on the hotel's economics and what we knew the demand was. And then the residential component, we originally wanted more units than what we were ultimately able to get. And that's in large part because of the height restrictions that ultimately were imposed on us, which is, I know, the kind of the line of questioning that we want to go into, because I had brought it up in one of the previous conversations that we had, just in terms of what the city forces you into and how you can make decisions on the fly.
Yeah, most definitely. So what factors led you to include the parking in that first concept?
So obviously, well, not obviously, there are some projects now that don't do parking, but I would say obviously you want parking in your building, even though some urban projects are now deciding not to include it. We were including parking as a component structurally from a market basis. We think that you need it. Coral Gables zoning code says that you need it. We went through some other things to actually get our parking reduced, our total amount of required parking reduced. But from a fourth component standpoint, and the reason I bring it up as a fourth component is that it actually is a revenue generator. In a lot of other cities, you probably don't have as widespread acceptance of paying for parking. In Miami or Coral Gables in general, if you're parking somewhere, you're paying. If you're parking on the street, you're paying. And so that was a whole educational process that I had to go through with lenders and investors and retail tenants and everyone. But that was a core part of why we looked at it from an economic standpoint, is because you can generate revenue from it, and you definitely have a lot of cost. And that cost component is why most developers are trying to minimize the amount of parking that they're putting in.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I tend to currently look at pieces of land with the highest and best use, and whether it's based off of asset class, the number of units, or just building something for mixed use. In early stages, it's hard to know who the tenants are going to be, for example, for the retail. Like, did you guys have a retail anchor going into it? And like, how did you guys design around either not knowing, and how'd the story come to be with that?
Yeah, so the way a lot of developers do it, and part of the way that our strategy originally was set up, was to do a token retail on the ground floor. And so you have your hotel. For us, it was a little bit different because you have a hotel that tends to want to have a restaurant with it. Just the synergies that you're going to have, that people aren't cooking in a hotel. So we were looking at having the ground floor of the hotel have restaurant space. So that was designated from day one. We knew we were installing grease traps and hoods and exhaust vents and all the rest of it, which, particularly in South Florida, when you're building large concrete structures, if you're going to build a restaurant, you need to understand that's what you're going to put in. So that side of the building was planned and ended up that way because of that synergy and the way that we had designed it. The other side of the property, underneath the residential component, is where things definitely did not go according to plan. And the reason for that was largely because of what the city required us to do during the entitlement process. Like I was saying, we had requested 142 feet of height. And so we would have had, if you just roughly say 10 feet per floor, we would have had an extra 3 floors because we ended up getting cut down by 3 levels. So roughly two of those probably would have been residential, and we would have had to have an additional level of parking because of those additional units, right? Yeah. And so those 3, or that 30 feet that we got cut down from 142 down to 112 forced us to reevaluate how we were structuring our retail program. I mean, that wasn't the only way that we could have gone with it, but when we knew or had some indication that was the direction the city commission was going to force us into, we started to strategize around what can we do to mitigate the loss of 2 floors of residential.
Yeah, probably significantly impacted the pro forma just in Excel and as far as numbers go.
Yeah.
And then to come up with an answer.
Right. And so that was a big part of what we were doing was I vividly remember sitting in the room, Brent on the whiteboard, me at the desk behind the computer, working on the Excel model, and him sketching things out and saying, okay, well, if we lose this component, where do we shift it? We had that stack of the building was residential, parking, retail, right? And so he was sketching out different ideas about it, and we were kind of going back and forth about the marketability of the spaces and what could we do with it, what would actually happen in the market, when would we have insight into whether the decisions that we made were actually going to come to fruition or not. We had to come to a resolution very quickly because this was in the middle of the city commission process, right? So as I had mentioned in one of our previous discussions, we had DRC, BOA, P&Z, city commission, right? Development Review Committee, the Board of Architects, Planning and Zoning Board, and then the city commission. So this was 18 months to get to this point, and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And we were down to the wire of if they cut us down, do we abandon the project or how do we mitigate?
So of those 4 boards, well, were they running in parallel? And then also, who was the one that ultimately made the decision to cut it back?
Almost always in almost all municipalities, you end up going sequentially, right?
Yeah.
So it was in that order that I just outlined
Yeah.
of how we went through it sequentially. And that's why it was an 18-month process. We actually had lots and lots of additional neighbor meetings where there were design charrettes that were going on, a term that prior to getting into
Design
development.
charrettes.
Yeah. That's a term that I had never heard until I got into the industry. And
Does that have anything to do with trades?
no,
Okay.
it's literally just inviting the community in and saying, how do we scope this project with the neighborhood in mind?
Yeah.
And so we did a lot of that where they would raise certain concerns about the hotel pool deck is on the side of the property that faces the single family residential neighborhood. How do we screen it for visibility and for noise? So that was one of the things that came out. The big thing for us and for the neighborhood seemed to always go back to height. And a lot of times people would bring up traffic or the noise, or they just don't like it, right?
Yeah.
But the big thing that everyone was hanging their hat on was the height. So each one of those boards that we had talked about was really just not each one of them was only a recommendation, but each one of them made a recommendation. City Commission ultimately had final say. And so the Planning and Zoning Board could have recommended that we only get 80 feet. And that being the last one before the commission, you wouldn't want to go in with a planning and zoning recommendation of 80 feet and you still asking for 142 and trying to just stand your ground when you're the one making the request.
Yeah.
So it ultimately falls to the commission who's writing the legislation or whatever sort of approval it is that you're seeking to make that final determination for you.